I want to check with you and ask a bunch of questions. Oh, huh?
Who was that? Who was your friend in ACT UP?
Malcolm Gregory Scott. He was ACT UP DC.
Oh, okay.
So, but yeah, he had a lot of interesting takes. And I want to try and sound smart, but I'll probably say like and a lot. So.
Okay, me too. It's a deal.
I'm officially a Northern Californian after 19 years, I think, so I can get away with this.
Okay.
It says recording, but I don't know because I'm like, I don't want to talk to. Is this part going to be on YouTube, or I think they're going to edit it? Let me just look pretty and just shut my mouth. Oh, it's Jackson, I'm sure.
Okay. He's nervous.
Jackson's like, it's recording, be quiet. So like,
I know Dina can cut it down in post, so I think we can start at a certain time.
Okay.
Oops. On and off. Okay, I think we are actually live now. I'm broadcasting to the YouTube link. So great. Thank you, Sarah and Brontez, for joining us. I'm definitely not at the lab. I'm in Massachusetts right now, but I'm very, very happy to have you both here. And you both have new books out with Farrar, Straus, and Giroux. So very, very excited to get your book soon, Sarah. But yeah, just to give you a little background on the lab is a 37-year-old artist-run space, or used to be artist-run space, and it is in San Francisco, in the Mission District of San Francisco. And we have kind of restructured the programming over the past 7 years to give artists a lot of funding, time, space, resources, really trying to allow a lot of the effort of the institution kind of to recede to the background and allow the artists have enough time and space to reconfigure the idea of the platform for their work entirely. So these forums have been a way of kind of bridging conversations across activists, artists, and kind of critical thinkers across these fields, and allowing those conversations to really be proposals to the public and allowing the public to answer back. And I was talking, of course, Brontez and I have had this ongoing conversation since you've been in residence with us, and how extraordinary it was to put on the Ed Mock documentary with you. That was just absolutely, producing the Dances of Ed Mock was one of the greatest privileges of my life, I think. So the wonderful thing about trying to figure out how to respond online through this terrible Zoom structure to a situation like the pandemic, and of course, you know, thinking about why does it take one crisis, one pandemic to respond to a prior crisis and pandemic. And I was at MoMA PS1 a week ago, and was just thinking about how they have 2 exhibitions up right now that are both about the AIDS crisis, and just how these things constantly get reiterated and responded to in time. So I'm really excited and honored to have both of you here today, and I'm going to leave it to Brontez to do the majority of the introduction of Sarah. So thank you both for being here, and looking forward. Talk to you soon.
Yeah.
Hey, how's it going? My name is Brontez Purnell. I am so nervous that I forgot to pull up your bio. So if you give me a second, I can read it. I came to my boyfriend's house to have faster internet, and of course now it's going slower. but I'll start by saying like, how you doing today? How are you? Where are you? What's going on?
Chicago at my girlfriend's house. We were just in New Orleans for her sister's 50th birthday, and we drove back.
Oh
back
my
last-
god.
Yeah, it was really, really fun. I had a great time.
Cool. Are you like in Chicago for a long period of time or?
I go back and forth, but I spent a lot of COVID here because housing, there's a lot more room here than there is in my apartment in New York. Yeah.
No, for sure. So here it is. I'm gonna read it real quick, just to be a little perfunctory. Sarah Schulman and Brontez Purnell engage in a conversation about queer histories, emotional landscapes, and Schulman's new book, Let the Record Show, a political history of ACT UP New York, 1987 to 1993. Schulman, a former San Francisco resident, will also deconstruct, you were never an SF resident. Yo, why does everyone say that though? Like, I hang out in some prominent lesbian circles and they're always like, well, she used to live here. Like, well, actually, yeah, I'm gonna finish reading this later. Like, tell me what's the tea on that?
So years ago, I taught at the Art Institute. It was a triptych with Kathy Acker, Mary Gateskill, and me. And the students had each of us. Yeah. So I was in San Francisco for a few months, and I was staying with my friend Bo Houston, who was a writer who died of AIDS. This is a really long time ago, but I was never a San Francisco resident.
What year was this?
I can't even remember. It was like late 80s, maybe.
Oh my gosh. You must have broke a couple of hearts and people like want to mythologize you here. I'm sure everybody wants to claim you though.
That's nice.
No, yeah. Well, I guess I don't know. I want to start there though. Even like that short time you were here, like what do you remember from then? Like San Francisco in the late 80s? Like,
well, I can remember, the neighborhood was still called Western Addition.
oh yeah. You mean NOPA? You were staying there and teaching at the Art Institute.
Yeah, no, I was staying in Bernal Heights, but I had friends all over, and Soma, I had these guys I knew who I barely knew them, but they ran Drummer magazine, and they
Whoa.
yeah. A lot of people have died from that time, but yeah, no, it was fun city, San Francisco, especially for gay women. It was the first place I ever went where women net. In New York, that people would be in the closet at work and then they would come home and change their clothes. But in San Francisco, they never did that. So people were out all the time. And it was the first time I'd ever seen that.
Oh, cool. Huh. Well, I guess before I get into it, can I ask you like a really stupid question? Okay, cool. What's your sign and how do you think it affects your work?
I'm a
Since
Leo.
A Leo?
Yes. So I'm viciously loyal. Let's put it that way.
I love that. I totally love that. So this book is like in scale, it's like crazy. Like it's pretty dizzying or whatever. I guess the first question really is why 93 and like not 95? Like when, kind of like the protease inhibitors, like kind of.
Well, they came in like in 96, but by that time, ACT UP had really dissipated quite a bit. So I wanted to end at the height of the chaos and not have the happy ending of the protease inhibitors when ACT UP was already dissipated, because I wanted to capture the experience. So at the end of the book, there's a group, there's an affinity group called the Marys, and 3 of their members died within 10 weeks of each other. And all of them had requested political funerals. So their surviving friends had to do what they wanted. And they're just like running around carrying their corpses and driving their dead bodies around in vans and carrying them through the streets with open coffin to Tompkins Square Park and all of this stuff, because they promised their friends they would. And there was an insanity edge to it. And that's what it was like to be in ACT UP at a certain point. So I just wanted to end right there.
Oh, wow. No, that's so cool. I might ask some questions that seem a little redundant because I think the book just came out and a lot of people haven't, like fully read it yet. So we'll go through that a little bit. But I also don't want you to reveal too much if you don't feel like. I'm sure you know what to do.
To give away. Yeah.
No, yeah. Well, I kind of guess like the scale of it too. Like, what was like your mental preparation for doing something like this? Like, because I mean, even when we say like, oh, this is not a definitive history or whatever, like it automatically becomes that when not a whole lot of people write about it, and especially haven't done like kind of like the length of work and like research and just like oral history on top of oral history on top of oral history. When you were first starting and knew that it had to become a book, like what was your kind of what was like your set of like kind of organizing rules or organizing principles for it? Or like what were you setting out to do?
History, because so when I was a girl reporter on the go for like the feminist press and the gay press starting around 1979. And, AIDS was first noticed by science in the US in around 81. Of course, now we know it had existed maybe for the whole century before that, certainly since the 40s in the United States. But the New York Times announced it July 3rd, 1981, without calling it anything. It was 41 cases of rare cancer in homosexuals in San Francisco. That was the headline. At that point, I was a City Hall reporter, and I was covering the fact that there was no gay rights bill in New York City. Ed Koch was the mayor. So what that meant was you could get thrown out of a restaurant. You could be denied a hotel. You could be fired from any job. You could be denied any apartment. I mean, it was dire. And so that's why I was at City Hall all the time. Mayor Koch, Sarah Schulman, New York native, when are we getting a gay rights bill? Then there was AIDS. So I started covering stuff related to AIDS. And I covered mostly social justice through a social justice lens. So I covered like pediatric AIDS, women being excluded from experimental drug trials, homeless people with AIDS. But I also covered things like the closing of the bathhouses. And the fact that I was assigned to cover that shows you how crazy everything was, because women weren't allowed in the bathhouses. But it was so chaotic that reporters were dying, editors were dying. My editor, Robert Massa at the Village Voice, edited me in his pajamas because he was too sick to get to work. It was very crazy, and the mainstream press was not covering anything. So I'm doing all this stuff. So by the time ACT UP starts in 1987, I'd already been covering AIDS for 5 years. And in those 5 years, 40,000 people had died. And the government had done absolutely nothing. And for all the pharmaceutical companies were doing was recycling failed cancer drugs that they own the patents for, that they were trying to get the market. It was total chaos and abandonment. ACT UP starts in March 1987. I joined in July 1987. So then ACT UP in 92, 12 people left ACT UP, and that's the split. Hundreds of people stayed, but that was sort of like the beginning of the demise. And 1993 was like a very painful year. Many, many people died in ACT UP, and ACT UP's actions got very, very desperate. And eventually I left at that point. 96 is the protease inhibitors. 99 is the internet revolution. And that's when ACT UP disappeared from public view because none of our stuff was digitized. So if you searched it online, you would get nothing. So people had zero access to ACT UP. So by 2001, which was officially the 20th anniversary of AIDS, but it was really the 20th anniversary of when they noticed AIDS. I was listening to the radio and they're like, at first, America had trouble with people with AIDS, but then they came around. That is not true. There's a myth that America is so benevolent and they just figure out that they should be nice to people. This is a complete lie. The truth was that thousands of people fought until the day they died to force the country to change. So that's when Jim Hubbard and I were like, okay, we cannot allow this. And we started the ACT UP Oral History Project. So we started interviewing people. So our original idea, and Urvashi Vad, who's a great leader of our movement, was at the Ford Foundation and she got us money. So our original idea is we're going to produce raw data and academics or somebody is going to analyze this data and we'll make it available for free. So for the next 18 years, we interviewed 188 people from ACT UP. And we put all the transcripts up online. It's at actuporalhistory.org. And we've had 14 million hits, by the way. But nobody came along and analyzed the data. We just kept adding stuff and adding stuff. Then Jim made a film in 2012 called United in Anger, A History of ACT UP. And other stuff started to come out at that point. So we had already been interviewing for 12 years. And that stuff that was coming out was not true. It was like, here are the 5 white men who saved the world. Here are the individuals who defeated AIDS. And we're like, no, 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 that's not what happened. This was a very complex movement and it involved huge numbers of people. It was the fact that it was a coalition that made it successful. And the whole story was being whitened and mailed into this like heroic white hero, John Wayne thing. And it was making us ill. So we were like, somebody has to do the truth here. And we kept trying to find somebody to write the book and we couldn't find anybody. And finally, it was a state of emergency. And Jim and I decided that I was going to have to do it. So I spent 3 years revisiting all of the interviews we had conducted and cohering the tropes from them and producing this book. Now, when I first pitched the book, I said it was going to be short. And then like at some point, Jackson Howard, our mutual beloved editor, was not the acquiring editor. He inherited the book. So at some point I was just like, it's going to be long. You know, it might be 400 pages. Anyway, it ended up being 700 and something. But it was necessary because the book is about 140 people.
Goddamn right.
So there you go. And then Jackson was like, well, you can have 60 photographs. So I started emailing people saying, do you have photographs that no one's ever seen? And I got these amazing, absolutely amazing photographs. So it really all turned out very wonderfully.
No, for sure. Thank you for fighting for me.
Okay.
First of all, I wanted to get that out of the way. I might tear up because I'm really, emotional. But maybe kind of like a personal question because I wanted to get at the heart of the matter. I read the part in the book where you said that you were like doing interviews, or like the gay newspaper. You said you were how old? 24? Is that
Yeah.
Okay, well, before that, like you said, you came into this work with reproductive justice rights and stuff like that. Like, how did you get your start in this? Were your parents activists or anything like that? Or how did
I came from a Holocaust family. So I was born in 1958, which is 13 years after the end of the Holocaust, which is not that much, right? And my mother's aunts and uncles were all exterminated and murdered in the Holocaust. Not all of them, but 4 of them. And my mother's father's sister was murdered in the Holocaust. My mother didn't have any grandparents. It was like one of those situations. So I was raised, I knew about the Holocaust since the day I was born. And, I was given Anne Frank's diary when I was like 6 years old. And I knew the whole story. So, because people were not protecting children at that time, right? This is a different era. And the main thing that I had heard was other people stood by and let this happen. The neighbors knew what was happening. They did nothing. This message over and over and over. And then I was gay. My parents were very homophobic. I come from not only a homophobic family, but a very sexist family. And I was a smart girl, which was a very bad thing to be. So all that, I'm like, but they just stood by and did nothing. And wait a minute, you're doing this. And then, I grew up in New York City, and like everyone my age who's born in the 50s or 60s, I saw Black resistance on television in Life magazine. My mother took me to demonstrations against the Vietnam War. I saw people in resistance. I didn't know that there was ever going to be a gay community or a gay movement, but I internalized that resistance is correct. And I ended up, my family was very homophobic. I ended up on the outs of my family, and I had to fight. And, in the 70s, there was a huge lesbian movement. Our leaders were Audre Lorde and Adrienne Rich. Audre Lorde was my college professor at Hunter College. Yeah. So
Okay.
I got into it, and 1979 was when the Hyde Amendment passed, which was so abortion becomes legal in 73. So I was still in the high school generation where like girls would get pregnant and disappear and drop out of high school, right? So 73, abortion becomes legal. By 79, they had the Hyde Amendment where if you were poor, you couldn't get an abortion except in certain states. They took away all the Medicaid funding. So I immediately joined the movement. So I was 21 against the Hyde Amendment, which was the reproductive rights movement, which was the radical abortion rights movement. And then that's how it all began.
Huh. What was the jump between that and when you got hired at like the paper?
Oh, there was no hired. Nobody was paid. The whole underground press, the lesbian press, the feminist press, the gay press, there also was a socialist gay and lesbian newspaper called Gay Community News from Boston. None of us got paid. There was no funding. Gay things did not get funded. Homosexuality was illegal. There was no funding, none. Also, my early books were all published by like tiny little presses. You know, there was no FSG for people like us. You and me, there was none of that for us at the time.
Whoa.
Okay.
No,
This was political work. You were part of a movement.
Can I ask you a messy question?
Yeah.
Do you think they hired you because all the gay dudes were like at the bathhouse, like, you know, sucking wee-wees and stuff and too busy to report?
He was hired.
I mean, not hired, but, so did you just come and say, oh, this is what I want to cover, this is what I'm doing? Like it was more.
And if they liked what you did, they would send you out. Or they'd give you assignments if you develop. But nobody was paid, nobody.
Wow. No, I mean, no, I totally get that. I wrote for this publication called Maximum Rock and Roll for like years and years and years. I think they just started paying people last year, but yeah, like, well, I mean,
The Voice,
again, thank you.
okay, The Voice paid, it was like $100 or something. Yeah.
So I guess I'll jump forward a little bit in time because I like to like ask questions like this because I don't know, sensory things are really important to me. But the first ACT UP meeting you stepped into, like what neighborhood, where was it, who was there, what were they serving for food, kind of what happened? Do you remember?
Okay, so there was never any food. All of the meetings were at the Lesbian and Gay Center. And I first went to an action before I went to a meeting. The action was at Sloan Kettering Hospital. And they had a contract for an experimental drug trial, but they weren't accruing enough people. And so ACT UP did a brilliant action, which was a 72-hour silent picket. Now, if you ask someone to do an action for 72 hours, they'd say, oh, I can't, I'm too busy. But then people could, because they were so committed, right? So for 72 hours, ACT UP did a silent picket in front of the hospital so that they didn't interrupt or, the patients who were in the hospital. So I went to that action. And then I went to the Monday night meeting, which was at that point, it was like 300 people, but ultimately that Monday night meeting was between 300 and 700 people.
Whoa, that's so crazy. I moved to the Bay probably, I think I moved to the Bay like at the end of 2002. And I went to like my first ACT UP meeting in 2002. This like lady saw me walking down the street and thought that I was a lesbian. And she like tried to pick me up and she was like, oh, I'm going to the ACT UP meeting here. And it was a Monday night meeting, but there was a bunch of food. I remember there being a bunch of food. But by this time also, I remember going back and telling like a lesbian roommate, oh, I went to an ACT UP meeting, and her treating it like it was something very passé to do. I think I was about 19 at the time. So I think I never really got a scale. It wasn't until I met a mentor of mine, a DC ACT UP person, that I got the scale of kind of what these meetings meant like in the 80s. Were there any other demos that like stood out to you or kind of?
I was involved in, all the major actions. I went to the Food and Drug Administration, which we shut down. I was there when we surrounded the National Institute of Health with smoke bombs and all kinds of 1,000 people. I got arrested at Trumpsgiving, which was an occupation of Trump Tower, because everyone who lives in New York always knew that Donald Trump was evil. So we did that. We occupied Grand Central Station on the day of desperation when the first Gulf War started, and I got arrested at that. Yeah, I was at all the Stop the Church. I was inside the church when we shut down Mass at St. Patrick's Cathedral in 1989.
Whoa. How did you like deal with or kind of move through like the immense, like probably moral, but also emotional fatigue?
I'm not an emotional fatigue type of person.
Okay.
I had not.
Queen!
Also, I've just been this way my whole, I never stepped away from people with HIV. So it starts when I'm 24, but here I am, I'm 62, I'm still doing it, right? So it's not like it ended and then I had a period of reflection or whatever. And I'm also, this is not my only political involvement. I'm a very big friend of Palestine. And I'm on the advisory board of Jewish Voice for Peace. And, so it was interesting because the Dina who introduced us was talking about how long it takes for the system or the apparatus to catch up with a fight for justice, right? And it's like, yeah, now this ACT UP can be commodified at this point. But what we really need to get on the table are the fight in Palestine, for example, the fights for justice that are the more, quote, controversial or that people are afraid to be associated with that are happening right this second, where you have to have some sense of decency to make a stand. So yes, there is a time war for certain things. And if only the system could embrace them as they're happening, instead of having to wait decades and decades.
Wow. No, for sure. So I know that the different kind of ACT UPs had just kind of different charges and way different things. I'm sure, New York is like where you're centered. So of course you're gonna write the ACT UP history. The SF ACT UP is kind of based in controversy. It later lends itself to conspiracy theories. The DC one was more administrative or whatever. Like, I think they like helped, and my friend Malcolm was saying they helped and like helped y'all front actions. In the Boston ACT UP, we see that the one doctor that comes out of there was the one who kind of invented standards of care for people with HIV. Just saying like a person with this many T cells needs this was the first to create that regimen. What I'm asking is the next book where it's like a comprehensive, trying to include a comprehensive history of like the whole structure. Do you think something like that would ever be possible? No.
No, there is a book about ACT UP LA. There is a book about ACT UP Chicago. It's for the local people to document their own movements. There were 148 ACT UP chapters. New York was the mothership. It was the original chapter, but it never functioned like a nationally coherent organization. Each chapter did their own thing their own way because each city had their own situation. New York had a very particular problem, which was our mayor was in the closet and he was not our friend. So we had this to deal with the mayor, whereas in San Francisco, there was much more cooperation. Like I had a friend who died in San Francisco, and I remember that if he went to the emergency room, there was a special triage system that he could get seen quickly. He could ride the buses for free. There was a whole different thing. In New York, people were dying on gurneys in hallways of hospitals. So each place had their own reality. In San Francisco, there was a split. It was San Francisco, ACT UP San Francisco and ACT UP Golden Gate. It split early, and then later, after it separated, ACT UP San Francisco became an HIV denialist group. They did not believe in HIV. And I believe that those people are dead, is my impression.
I worked at the building. It later became a pot store, and I worked at the building where all of it was archived. And I remember reading like the Vogue magazines and them documenting that kind of spectacle. It was kind of insane.
Well, it wasn't totally insane, because the thing was that so you could be exposed. There were people who were exposed, and never became HIV positive, right? So you needed to be exposed to HIV, but there was also something else that we called the cofactor, the other thing, and nobody knew what it was at the time. So because some people never got infected, people were like, well, it's not HIV. What is the cofactor? People were like, oh, it's poppers, it's this, it's that. So there was doubt. But then people you're right, paranoid, and there was a conspiracy theory. I mean, AIDS was so unbelievable and so punishing and so awful. I mean, people don't understand it was a terrible, terrible death, because what AIDS is that you have no immune system. So young people would go into dementia and blindness. I mean, it was absolutely horrible. And there was a feeling like, how could this be happening? So, that did feed paranoia and conspiracy theories. But they were wrong about HIV. Yeah.
No, for sure. Also, it's really interesting that me being like a Black man from down south, and in the book you kind of mention how we arrive at this place where we think that this disease is like in control, or we have like total control of it, whereas like the rates of like HIV amongst Black and Latino men down south is like insane. And just like to a personal testament to it, I have a younger cousin who's about 4 or 5 years younger than me. And I remember 4 years ago getting into like a vicious argument with him on a family thread that PrEP even existed. Like, and this was 4 years ago, he's like in his 30s, and I was telling him about PrEP, and he was like, there's no way that there's something like that. This is like pretty modern.
Well, Linda Villarosa, who's a very important lesbian journalist, a Black woman who writes for the New York Times. She did a cover story for the New York Times Magazine showing that Black gay men in the US South had a higher rate of HIV infection than any country in the world. And, because where you live in the US, what state you live in really impacts your situation as a person with HIV. She was showing that, for example, in Mississippi, they were charging $25 for an HIV test. There was just all these obstacles. So yeah. And also, we all know we don't have a coherent healthcare system in this country. So even today, there's still people who die of AIDS, which is ridiculous. And a lot of them are not diagnosed till they get into the emergency room because they have no healthcare.
No. Do you what are your places of hope around the next kind of 20 years as we move into?
Sooner than that. I think we're in a really great, exciting time now, because so many different kinds of people are politicized. So many different communities are active. There's much, in the 80s, the entire media was white and male. The whole private sector was white and male, and the whole government was white and male. And if there were gay men in that group, they were mostly in the closet. This is shifting and changing now. Now we have these great radical young women of color in the Congress, right? We have a whole different kind of voice in media. And there's these big movements against police violence, for immigrant rights, movements like Palestine Solidarity, all different iterations of Black movements in the United States. And it's a very exciting time.
I'm like getting together all my notes. I'm sorry, I'm just excited. So you were talking about kind of like the women in the movement and how their stories are kind of sidelined and erased. And to be honest, it probably wasn't a couple of years ago until like there was some story that came out about like a group of like lesbian nurses that took care of like gay men in the hospitals and stuff like that. And also, this is kind of more anecdotal, but the stories of like Elizabeth Taylor, like just going to random hospitals and saying hi to people who were dying and people thinking that they were in heaven because they were talking to her. What do you are there any stories from that that you particularly remember chronicling, or like you said a lot of these women are dead now, or
Brontez.
say again?
Those stories irk me because those are, I'll tell you why, because the stories are, oh, the women who took care of people when they were dying. But actually, women were theoreticians of the movement and leaders and activists, and women also had HIV. And one of ACT UP's greatest accomplishments was the 4-year campaign to change the government's definition of AIDS so that women with HIV could get benefits and get into experimental drug trials, which they were excluded from. No women could get into those trials. Now, that was a 4-year campaign. So today, every woman with HIV who takes an HIV med in the world is taking something that was tested on women because ACT UP won that change, you know. But people do want it to be that women are the caretakers. But in ACT UP, men were caretakers. It wasn't gendered. The Elizabeth Taylor story, that's very interesting also, because she was an early supporter of people with AIDS, and she did very important work. But a lot of people, gay people, were abandoned by their families. You know, familial homophobia was like a social force in the world. And the aloneness, and to have some famous person say, you are a human, like you have a life, that was so rare, you know, and it's part of why there's this diva adoration, right, that comes from that period, because people were abandoned.
No, for sure. You speak a lot in the book about just, you know, kind of when AIDS became public, it became this narrative of the straight person moving through their homophobia and helping just, you know, the gays who don't have community or whatever, when in actuality, it was because of the community of gays that we got kind of so far.
Right.
Can you, would you mind, do you want to speak to that a little bit, or?
Well, there were these things like the movie Philadelphia, if you remember that movie, is made by Jonathan Demme, and it won an Oscar, right? So the story was that there was a gay man with AIDS and he needed a lawyer. So he goes to a homophobic lawyer played by Denzel.
Of course.
Who heroically overcomes his prejudices to help the poor alone gay man. But in real life, he would go to a gay lawyer. But in the world of this movie, there were no gay lawyers because the conceit was that it's the hero, heterosexual hero. Same thing in Dallas Buyers Club. Those buyers clubs were run by gay men. They were not run by straight people. So, you know, over and over, or even Angels in America, where the guy abandons his boyfriend, which almost never happened, and there's no political movement. And then in the end, there's hope because they have AZT, which didn't work. You know, so the real stories, which were queer and heroes and people with AIDS as heroes, couldn't be told because it had to be that we were abandoning our partners, which we weren't, that we were cowards and treacherous, which we were not, and that straight people were the good ones and the heroes, which actually they abandoned people with AIDS. So it was the reversal of the truth. And all those works would get like Oscars, Tonys, Pulitzer Prizes, blah, 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 but they were not accurate.
For sure. How do you kind of deal with this dual stance of, I don't know, because of this book, I do think people will totally be like, will hold you as like a custodian of a large brain trust of like, you know, the ACT UP history. But there's also something about you where I feel like you reject kind of titles like that, or like
I have to be very careful. Like it's all just started about a week ago, this thing, and we're already in second printing. But I'm starting the process now. People are sending me stuff saying, would you do this speaking thing? Would you do this speaking thing? And I'm sending it to other people in ACT UP. Like I have to be careful and let that out there and bring in other people and spread it around, because I was not a leader in ACT UP. I was just a rank and file person. I historicized it with Jim Hubbard. but I can't come in to represent that movement. That doesn't make any sense.
Why do you think it doesn't make any sense?
Because people are still alive and still doing work. I mean, people like Peter Staley and David Barr and Greg Gonzalez, who are active treatment activists, they're all involved in trying to get vaccine out for free and not allow companies to patent the COVID vaccine. So they're still completely doing the work right now, and I'm not involved in that.
Huh. No, for sure. How do you feel like the future of AIDS activism will go?
It all depends on what happens with healthcare. As a separate movement, it's not viable, but as part of our need, our desperate, desperate need for a reasonable healthcare system in this country, it's part of it.
No, I totally agree. I think it's around 12:43, but I know that we're fielding questions from the audience. I don't know if I want to radio in Dina and ask if any of those are.
Okay.
Yes, absolutely. Please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen to ask questions. And we can kind of just chat a little bit while we wait for those to come in.
It's an amazing audience. I'm seeing all these Frank, Virgie Tovar. I'm seeing like a lot of friends. Camille Roy, the writer, is on there. It's an exciting list here.
It's remarkable. I loved what you said, Sarah, about this being a moment of hope, because we've learned so much about organizing and activism since ACT UP, and just the way in which ACT UP kind of framed those tools and those ways we communicate and learn from each other. I see that all through different kinds of organizing that I've been involved with, how those tools get shared and become the thing that is, the mutual aid and the small policy changes, that are happening as a result, and the intersectionality, the cross-germination between different movements. Yeah. Have you two met in person before?
Never.
No.
How were
I
you?
almost was like a little freaked out too, because I was just like, I'm essentially like a gay pulp writer. Am I prepared to talk to the Sarah Schulman?
Yeah, but if you read my novels, so am I, a gay pulp writer. I've written pulp.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah.
Maybe that's a necessary part of the process.
We have to move in. So no question, but this is amazing. Okay, so from an anonymous attendee, what was said about the line from ACT UP to current vaccine advocacy was so great. Could you speak to other ideas or structures from ACT UP that have continued in different ways today?
Thank you so much for that. So the reason behind this book is not nostalgia. The point of the book is to make activist information available for people who are organizing today, to see which strategies worked and which ones didn't work, because ACT UP was successful partially, and in many ways our most recent successful social movement. And so it would be great to learn from them. And some of the takeaways, I think the biggest lesson is that ACT UP was not a consensus-based movement. So people did not have to agree. It had a one-line statement of unity, which was direct action to end the AIDS crisis. And that was direct action as opposed to social service provision. So if you were doing direct action to end the AIDS crisis, you could do it. And if other people didn't like what you were doing, they wouldn't try to stop you from doing it. They would argue with you, but in the end, if they didn't like it, they just would go do what they did want to do, and you could do what you wanted. And this is the way to go. This is like a radical democracy structure with Big Tent politics, where a lot of different actions are going on at the same time in a lot of different realms, because people need to be supported to respond in a way that makes sense to them. And movements that try to force people into agreement or force everybody into one analysis or one strategy always fail. I don't think there's any exceptions. So radical democracy is the way to go. And that's one of the big takeaways from ACT UP. Another thing is that women and people of color in ACT UP never stopped the action to do like consciousness raising on sexism or racism in the group, because you could spend your whole life trying to change one person and fail. Instead, what they did was they marshaled the resources of the movement for their own projects. So like the Latino caucus went to Puerto Rico and started ACT UP Puerto Rico with funding from the group, that money that the group had gotten at an art auction. The campaign for women with HIV also used resources from the group to win important gains for women. You know, that's a very smart way of doing things. So not get caught up in trying to like change people.
Amazing. Someone here asks, we would love to hear about how Sarah wrote the other books written during the period of 1987 through 1993.
I've written a lot of books. I mean, this is my 20th book. I'm primarily a novelist. My first novel came out in '84. I have a new novel I'm writing now. So it's just a way of life for me. I'm really a natural and I'm just writing all the time and I enjoy it. And that's how I live.
Awesome. Okay. This is from Virgie. Oh my God, I love her so much. But is asking, new movements rely on social media, which is amazing for dissemination and discovery, but I find they too quickly become monetized. These marginalized communities need these resources, but depoliticizes movements, I think. I'm curious about your thoughts on the future of political movements with this in mind.
Well, in person is the best. And when you look at something like ACT UP or any movement, people spent a lot of time together. They lived together. They were arrested. They spent jail time together. They were in care groups for people who were sick and dying. And in that face time and that lifetime together, they talked about their lives and they talked about what they needed and they talked about ways of getting it. And they invented new ways of doing activism. And if they hadn't been together, they wouldn't have been able to do it. So together in real life is the most opportune way to go.
Really quickly, a nice, concise question. What was something that surprised you while writing this book?
Well, there was a Haitian Underground Railroad that was connected to ACT UP that I didn't know anything about. So when Aristide was elected president of Haiti and he was overthrown in a military coup, a lot of Haitians left Haiti and came to the US, in all kinds of ways. And the United States did not want Black immigrants. And so they tested a lot of people and they had a high rate of HIV positivity. So instead of allowing them to immigrate, where did they put them? Guantanamo. That is what Guantanamo was before it was used to hold Muslim political prisoners. So all these HIV positive Haitians were stuck in Guantanamo. The Center for Constitutional Rights was suing for their release. But the release, when it was won, was based on there had to be housing for them. So the ACT UP Housing Committee was running around trying to find housing so that people could get out of Guantanamo. And I have the whole story in the book, and like they would like find something somewhere or even lie about it. And then the Haitian person would like be put on the plane, in a little cotton dress and sandals and arrive in New York in the winter. And the ACT UP Housing Committee would be there and like giving people housing, HIV positive Haitians. I didn't know anything about that.
Jesus fucking Christ. Sarah, this is from Carrie Johnson. Sarah, you are a real myth buster and that is greatly appreciated. Can you talk more about why so many of us, even those of us who lived through the period, want to mythologize women as caregivers? Is it just plain old misogyny and stereotyping?
Yes, it is.
Bam, there we go. We got that out the way real quick.
To Carrie's new novel also.
Oh, whoa.
Okay.
Wait, I think this is the same Carrie I know. In Africa?
Is it Carrie Allen Johnson, right?
Yeah, okay, yeah. Oh, yeah, love them. Okay. From Natasha. Hi, I tuned in a bit late, but I was in New York City last week and it felt like the late 80s to me. Lots of conversations about trauma, the HIV virus and the COVID virus. Issues about vaccination and access are kind of haunting. I worked with ACT UP in the late 80s and lived in the East Village. Conversations recently were really vital. Also, some of my gay friends who lived through AIDS are refusing to get the COVID vaccine. How do you explain this resistance to government?
I don't know. I don't have an answer for that. But I will say New York is a very interesting place right now because it's completely alive, but the international tourists are not there. So it's like New Yorkers in the streets, and it's very chaotic. A lot of storefronts have been shut down. There's a crisis in commercial rents. There's a housing crisis. There's a lot of homeless people while there is a lot of empty space. We need a mayor who can seize the moment and move us forward. And I'm worried that we may not be able to get one.
I think we have a few more. So this is to both of us. Brontez and Sarah, how has the advent of PrEP changed both gay culture and American healthcare?
I don't have an answer for that. What do you say?
I remember I feel like I'm in that age group just before PrEP became really popular or like accessible. So sometimes I feel like if maybe I was 5 years younger, I'd still be HIV negative. But I think the best thing it did was, I don't know, I was kind of part of a rough crew in my 20s, bareback death cult, as you might say. Some people might refer to us as bug chasers. I don't remember it being that, but looking back, that's how people would frame that. I think PrEP kind of erased the politicality of being a boy who said, yeah, I don't really like condoms. One of my mentors explained to me that he felt sorry for my generation because AIDS just kind of happened upon them. But when I told him, oh yeah, like I was 5 when I knew about AIDS, and he was just kind of like, oh, you knew what AIDS was before you knew what sex was. I can't imagine what that means or what that meant to you. And so with PrEP, even though, I don't know, I go back home and I really worry about like my nephews and my cousins and all the younger men there. But I feel like this kind of access is maybe a first step somewhere.
A comment on that. You know, if you're HIV positive and you're on the meds, you're virally suppressed, so you're biologically incapable of infecting anybody, right? So actually the safest person you can have sex with is someone who's positive and virally suppressed. If everybody who was positive had the treatment, the standard of care that they as a human being deserve, would you need PrEP?
Real talk. No, for sure. That's, no. Again, always a lot to think about. I always have to breathe deeply a little bit as these things hit me. Oh, this is from my friend Tate. Me and Tate worked together at the old ACT UP. I work at a university and I'm intrigued seeing how many people who are 18 to 21 years old are focused on ACT UP as a research topic. Do you have any top thoughts on why Gen Z, they say this in quotation marks, is so fascinated by ACT UP as an organization? I'm a geriatric millennial, but I suspect it might tie into Virgie's point about social media.
It's probably because Jim and I have done such a good job at getting all the images out. And, you know, like I said, 14 million people have come to the website. And, you know, it's a movement where we've made the information available for free. So people have access to it. So that's probably why they're interested in it.
Access is like always key. So this is from Trey. Thank you for this amazingly insightful conversation. On the topic of social media organizing, I have found throughout my work in mental health activism, it does not include populations who do not have consistent access to technology. Do you have any advice for a younger organizer like myself who are working to support an extremely broad and disenfranchised population of community members in SF and California? I am excited to adopt ACT UP strategies discussed in Sarah's work. Go off.
Yes, I would like to talk to you. So in the book, I juxtaposed 3 different campaigns that were done in ACT UP by people with different levels of access, just to show what happens when you compare. So on one hand, like Larry Kramer went to Yale with the guy who ran Bristol Myers Pharmaceutical Company. So he could call him up and they got a meeting, and he brought a former stockbroker and a Harvard graduate, and they went to Bristol Myers, or they went to Burroughs Wellcome, and they had like a catered lunch and they talked to the scientists. Everyone's a white male in that picture, right? Then you juxtapose that with the campaign of women with HIV. Now that was a campaign mostly of women of color, poor women, white lesbians in ACT UP. This campaign took 4 years. It took 2 years to even get a meeting, right? And they had to do all kinds of things like handcuff themselves to people and scream at people in airports and break into offices and all this sort of thing. And they finally won after 4 years, but most of the leaders had already died by that point, but they did win. Then I juxtapose this with the campaign by IV drug users in ACT UP. And this was incredibly messy. I mean, 2 people OD'd and died. One guy stole $10,000 from ACT UP. They deliberately broke the law against needle exchange, deliberately got arrested, had a trial and won, and made needle exchange legal in New York. So what you learn from looking at these 3 communities is that whoever you are, you can win. But it's harder, takes longer, and it's messier. And respectability politics only belong to people with access. If you don't have the access, you have to do whatever you need to do to force your issue forward. But it's possible for every community to move forward.
Awesome. So we have 2 more questions. They're really important, and I kind of want to end here. We're going to go just a tiny bit over. But Sarah, Sarah speaks that the book is a handbook of strategies. What strategies would you push to the forefront in these particular times?
Radical democracy and Big Tent politics. Like right now, there's all these different movements on the ground, and they have certain things in common and other things that they don't agree on, and don't fight with each other and march shoulder to shoulder. But when you have your group of people, like-minded people, you have to try to be as effective as possible. And the way to be effective is that you design the solution. You don't go to act like a child in relationship to the powers that be as a parent and ask them to fix it. You know what needs to be done. You design it. You present your reasonable, winnable, and doable solution to the powers that be. And when they say no, you do what Dr. King called self-purification, or what ACT UP called nonviolent civil disobedience training. And you create direct actions that communicate through the media, not to the media, but through the media to the public to show your solution and try to force the powers that be to accept what you have created.
Amazing. And this kind of, I love this question. It's from Justine Jones, a friend of mine in Los Angeles. Hi, Justine. But she asked, hi, Sarah. Would you, in fact, elaborate a bit on the relationship between your pulp novels and your life and work as an activist?
There's almost no relationship. I have no idea. When you're an artist, you're an individual voice. And if you're a progressive artist, you're doing stuff that people haven't seen before. When they look at it, they think it's wrong. And then 10, 20 years later, they think it's great. And you're always pushing that envelope, right? But when you're working with a community, you're working collectively. So in a way, it's like the group has to fight to make the space for the individual voice. So they're mutually dependent.
No, for sure. That's cool. I want to say thank you for your work. My life depended on it, and here we are.
Thank you.
And I love you dearly.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much.
So Dina's back on, and yeah, we're at 1. So I'll let you take it away, Dina.
Thank you both so much. There's so much there. I will have to go back and listen again. But thank you everyone for your questions. I really, this is like a very good example of what the forum is about, which is this cross-germination of ideas and proposals. And each of the audience questions kind of hits on what we're trying to do there. No artist talks. We don't believe in artist talks. So I think I just want to say going forward, we're going to be announcing our launching or premiering Asher Hartman's project, The Dope Elf, online in about a week. So very, very excited to be launching that through the lab. So stay tuned. If anybody would like to support the lab, we are a community-based organization. We depend on like small micro donations and memberships to stay alive. And hopefully we can be a hub and a space for conversations like this in the future. So thank you so much, Sarah and Brontez. It was so great to hear. Yeah.
Oh, I have a talk tonight with Alvin Orloff at the San Francisco Public Library, 7 p.m. our time. If anybody wants to come by and hear me and Alvin go over it. So
is it?
I'm talking with all my Jewish elders today. So.
Cool.
All right, bye. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Yes.
Here.
All right, cool. I love you. Talk to you soon.